Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning, our friends in Latin America. This is a new edition of our webinar series, Latin America Policy Dialogues. As you all know, these seminars are a platform for leading Latin American policymakers and researchers to address the region's key economic and social challenges, and also to explore policy options. We are greatly honored to welcome Ernesto Talvi with us today. Ernesto is a good friend. We don't need to spend too much time introducing you. Ernesto, everybody knows you, but I just wanted to say that you are a very distinguished economist in the region and beyond. You are a thought leader whose work has significantly advanced our understanding of Latin American economies. You've been Foreign Minister of Uruguay, and now you are at the Elcano Royal Institute in Madrid. We very much look forward to your insights. What you're going to be sharing with us today is the key messages of your latest book, Why Latin America Matters, a book where you offer a very timely, very compelling analysis of the region's critical role in today's interconnected world. You underscore the region's contributions to global economic growth, to environmental sustainability, cultural diversity, geopolitical stability, several elements or features of Latin America that sometimes get overlooked in some of the more recent analysis. You and your co-authors argue that the region's challenges and potential have very important implications for the global landscape, and we very much look forward to hearing from you. If that's okay with you, Ernesto, after your presentation, we have some time for Q&A. Let me take the opportunity to ask those participants to basically use the chat, if you can, for your questions, for your comments. We will collect those questions and comments and share with Ernesto for his reply. Also, please bear in mind that the seminar is being recorded. We obviously intended to use highlights for disseminating key messages of the seminar, as we do regularly for our seminar series. And with that, Ernesto, muy bienvenido. The floor is yours.
Okay, Luis, thank you very much for your kind introduction. Thank you very much to you, to Aida, for the invitation, and a special thanks to Gema, who supported us with all the needs that we had through the process. Luis, look, the goal of this book that we wrote basically was to try to shift the paradigm through which Latin America is seen, even by us, Latin Americans, to a more balanced view that is actually data-based. I mean, so we prefer data rather than narratives, okay? Or the narratives that are informed by the data, okay? And this is especially important in this day and age, okay? In which we don't know anymore what's the truth and what's fake and anything in the middle, okay? So if I were to start with the preconceptions that we found and we summarized in 5, they are these. Look, Latin America is politically very unstable, with unpredictable rules of the game. It is an economic failure, prone to recurrent crises and unable to sustain growth and development. Due to the above, political instability and economic failure, US and EU firms have lost interest, strategic interest in the region, and are withdrawing because their investments went sour and do not add value for their shareholders. And China has jumped in to fill in the vacuum, and it's now the dominant player in the region. And this has led to this increased or perceived increased Chinese influence has led to a weakening of the geopolitical alignment of Latin America with the West. This is, I mean, I don't mean that everybody thinks around this paradigm, but let me tell you that a lot of people do, even in Latin America. So let's start by the first, that Latin America is politically unstable and with unpredictable rules of the game. Okay, so if you look at the trends, recent trends, we see that in Latin America, democracy as a system able to solve people's problems is losing ground. There is disenchantment with elites, with established parties, and there is therefore there is a fringe parties are appearing to left and right to challenge these established parties. This has led to political polarization. It has led to fragmentation of political systems and therefore to a very complex governance. Now, the question I immediately ask to somebody in Europe, does it sound familiar? Because actually, I could have been describing what's happening all over Western Europe. And therefore, when we evaluate and view Latin America, we cannot evaluate it in isolation. We cannot rate Latin America on the basis of an ideal kind of standard. We are part of the real world. We are not an island. This is happening everywhere. This is a global phenomenon. We are not escaping from that global phenomenon. Second, and interestingly, in Latin America, we have been here before. If you look at all these indicators of the disenchantment with democracy, with established parties, with elites, and the fragmentation, polarization, and complex governance, well, you look at the end of the cycle of crisis, 1998, 2002, and we were just about where we are today. So Europe has not seen it anytime recently, but we did. And we came back from that. And that's an important lesson for the world. It is not that this is the end of the world that we know it. It is a phase through which we've gone through many times, and we've gotten out of it. So there is a cyclical component to what everything that we're seeing and it's happening in Latin America. But the foundations are very sound. In Latin America, 74% of the countries of the region are considered democracies by the economists, whether perfect or imperfect democracies or full or imperfect democracies, it doesn't matter. We are 74%. This is the largest number in the emerging market world. So when we compare ourselves to our peers, we are in the first place in terms of democratic governance. If you look at respect for human rights, well, 84% of the countries in Latin America, according to Transparency International, largely respect human rights. Again, this is by far the highest number for all emerging regions, with the exception of accession countries to the European Union, if we consider them emerging Europe, okay? Third, the support for democracy. When you ask people a key question, not is democracy able is democracy being able to solve your problems? And there is a retrenchment and a disenchantment. But when you ask people, in spite of its problem, is democracy better than its alternatives? Well, close to 70% of the people in Latin America say that it is. So, and moreover, when you ask people to define themselves in the ideological map, center, center right, center left, left and right, close to 70% define themselves within the center of the political spectrum. So people, how do I interpret this? Well, the electorates are frustrated, they are annoyed, and established parties somehow are the destinataries of this frustration, but they are not radicalized in any meaningful sense. And I think that the extraordinary example of this was the election of Boric in Chile, which eventually he governed very close to the center, but he was far away from the center when he was a candidate. He was elected. People were saying, we'll give you a chance to govern, to see if you can do better than the established parties. But when he supported wholeheartedly a reform of the constitution that would have changed dramatically the social political organization of Chile, people said overwhelmingly, look, we didn't ask you to come here and refound our country. We simply asked you to, we simply trusted you to see if you can govern better than your competitors. And I think that the fact that people are frustrated but not radicalized, what happened in Chile is like a controlled experiment of that, okay? Second, it's a continent prone to crisis. Just numbers. Between 1974 and 2003, there were 153 exchange rate banking and debt crises in emerging markets, or any combination thereof. 153, 52% of them were in Latin America. We had an average of 4 crises a year. Between 2004 and 2023, we had in emerging markets 45 crises. So the incidence of emerging market crises declined substantially, and only 25% were in Latin America. So not only the number of crises, but the incidence, the participation in crisis has declined very significantly, and this did not occur through spontaneous combustion. It occurred, and this is also in the report, due to an enormous progress in macroeconomic policies, whether monetary, fiscal, and financial. Unable to develop. Latin America is the continent of the future and will never and will always be. Well, if you look at the numbers, 25%, Latin America is today, I mean, give or take 25% of US income per capita. If you look at the post-war period, late 1950s, early 60s, we were 25% of US income. So 70 years, 75 years after, we are still in the same place. So it appears to validate the idea that we are unable to develop if we understand by development converging to rich country incomes. Well, let me tell you, if we look at the post-World War II period up until today, how many countries went from being underdeveloped, i.e. below 30% of US income, to being developed, that we define 70%, more than 70% of US income? Well, only 5 actually accomplished that feat in the last 75 years. Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Singapore. That's it. There's nobody else. Okay? And therefore, we are, in a sense, judging Latin America against a very unlikely outcome. So even China, look at China. China has today approximately the same income per capita as Latin America. And the moment it reached that income, growth started to disinflate very sharply. India, the other rising star in the world, has half the income per capita of Latin America. So even the new Asian kind of miracles in terms of growth, I mean, one is flanking now that it's middle income, and the other one has not even gotten there. So we need to be, in this sense, careful in judging performance relative to something that is virtually impossible to attain. And if we look at the Human Development Index in Latin America, which not only includes income per capita, then Latin America is the second emerging region after accession countries in emerging Europe in terms of Human Development Index. Okay? So again, don't believe that I'm trying to paint a rosy scenario. We try to balance the lens through which we view Latin America, because the lens through which we view it, in a sense, drives decisions. And in many cases, we are being more stringent with Latin America than we are with other emerging regions. US and EU firms have lost interest in Latin America because they cannot earn value for their shareholders, and they are somehow abandoning the region. Well, this is false. We did the analysis with Spanish firms. Actually, our president, Jose Juan Ruiz, did a work of archaeology with this. It took a lot of data mining, firm by firm. So basically, he calculated the rate of return on Latin American investments during the period between 2000 and 2023. It was 4.8% per year. If you look at the investments of Spain in other EU countries, the rate of return was 3.5% per year. So fine, Latin America has a higher return because there is higher risk, and that's okay. That's what we should expect. But it is not that shareholders actually are losing their value. There are cases in which that happened, but on average, it did not. Actually, they earned 4.8% per year in the last 25 years, okay? And it is very interesting because then you immediately could ask the question, well, and if they are earning money for their shareholders, then why are they withdrawing from the region? Well, they are not. When you look at the FDI of Spanish firms, it is very interesting. 100% of the profits are being reinvested in Latin America. Mm-hmm. So why do we have the perception that they are withdrawing? Well, maybe because we analyze individual cases in which that happens, but more importantly, because this is what I like to call a stealth FDI. Very invisible. Reinvesting dividends doesn't make headlines. Headlines were made in the 90s when you were buying into a privatization, when you had a merger and an acquisition or whatever. That made headlines. But reinvesting dividends, if Santander reinvests its dividends in Uruguay, why is it going to make any headlines? But actually, you are betting everything you earn again in the region. So firms are voting, putting their money where their mouth is. So it is false that European firms, in this case Spanish firms, did not earn money for their shareholders, and it is false that they are leaving the region. They are investing in ways that are not as visible. The opposite is happening with China. So there is a perception that China has become the dominant player, but China invests in very visible, headline-grabbing things like ports, like the electricity grid, like mines, mineral, land for producing food or whatever, you name it. It's not reinvesting dividends. But then we had to verify if that was right. You know, China's FDI, the stock of FDI in Latin America was 1% of GDP in 2023. 1% of GDP. This is the lowest in every emerging region, the lowest. The accumulated investment by the US and the EU is 30% of GDP, is 30 times that of China. Now, you can always argue, so there's a lot of reinvestment of profits going on of firms that were already there. Now, you can argue, well, this is the stocks, and the stocks, there is a lot of history here, and it is reasonable to expect that the US and the EU will dominate very substantially. What about the flows? Well, let's look at the flows of the last 3 to 4 years. The China flows of FDI to the region are half the size of its participation in global trade and the global economy. And the US and the EU are 4 or 5 times the size in flows than China. So the EU is losing ground in Latin America, but to the US, not to China. Okay? So again, we should view this with a little bit of balance in terms of, I don't mean that this is an irrelevant phenomenon. On the contrary, it is a relevant phenomenon, specifically coming from a country where values in terms of democracy and human rights are not exactly the ones that we held dear, as we saw. But nonetheless, it is a lot less impactful than it seems. Now, is the geopolitical alignment with the West of Latin America weakening due to this increased Chinese influence, which is bound to be inevitable because it is a third of the world economy today? It was only 2% of the world economy in 1990. So it has to be important, more important, but it is not as important as we saw as it should be, not in Latin America. And so to try to come up with a framework, a useful framework to think about geopolitics in Latin America in the context of this geopolitical rivalry or strategic competition between the US and China. So we looked at the UN General Assembly resolutions since 2001 until 2023 regarding 2 sets of issues, regarding what I like to call values: democracy, rule of law, respect for human rights, that type of resolutions, and those that have to do with trade, with development, with economic sanctions, which we consider economic interest kind of resolutions. So let's look at the values, the resolutions that have to do with supporting democracy, rule of law, and human rights. Well, in those 22 years, Latin America voted resolutions regarding values overwhelmingly with the West. Because we are considering resolutions, I forgot to say this, that in which China and the US and the EU voted in opposite sides. The US and the EU voted on one side, China and Russia on the other. And this not always happens. Many times the EU does not align with the US, for example, regarding Israel, regarding Cuba. But in these cases that we chose, the US and the EU are aligned. And in fact, other developed countries turn out to be also aligned. And Latin America, 80% of the countries are aligned with the US and the EU when values are concerned. Moreover, and this is something, believe me, I was not expecting, that alignment relative in values is not a function of whether the government in office is center-right or center-left. Approximately the same number of resolutions are being supported, the same percentage, a large one, by center-left and center-right governments. So this is like a política de Estado. This is defending our values is something that at least center governments of the center, right or left, actually respect. And moreover, this alignment with the West is by kilometers, the highest among every other emerging region except for accession countries in the European Union, to the European Union. So yes, we are the South of the West. We are the West of the South. We are the West. And we behave as such. And on economic interests, trade, development, economic sanctions, well, you look at the resolutions regarding those, and we always align with China. Now, every other single emerging region also aligns with China. So to me, this is more an alignment with our peers in the emerging world than actually with China, which is also part of the emerging world, okay? Now, is this a useful, because people will tell you, look, you know, General Assembly resolutions, people can vote and it has no consequence. Okay, taken, well taken. Let me see if this way of eliciting the geopolitics of the region gives us a result, which is what I like to call selective alignment. We align with our values, in values with the West, we align in economic interests with China and the other emerging markets. It's not neutrality, it's selective alignment. Is this a useful framework to think about actual policy? And I will argue, I give you two examples, and with this I'll give you the final message, that it is. Look at the Russian invasion of Ukraine. When you look at the resolutions condemning the invasion, calling for an end of the war, calling for an end of the occupation, Latin America overwhelmingly voted with the US and the EU and other developed countries against China, Russia, Iran. Now, when it comes to economic sanctions, Latin America sided with China, Russia, and other emerging economies in opposing them. But this is a tradition. We always oppose economic sanctions conceptually. So we condemn the invasion, we call for the end of the war and the end of the occupation, but we do not support economic sanctions as a means to solving this type of crisis. And the second example I want to put is when values, which I think is useful, values and economic interests, in a sense, presented a trade-off. So you don't want to annoy China because it's a very important client for our exports. Well, at the same time, you want to align yourself in terms of values with the West, and what do? Well, I love this example, which is who is your supplier of military equipment? Who do you trust in depending for your own defense and security? Well, let me tell you, Mexico and Central America buy 90% of their military equipment and the service, maintenance, replacement, and everything that comes with it, together with joint operations to learn how to use it, blah, blah, blah. 90% of the purchases of military equipment are done in the US. Now, South America is a very different story, but because it is very European. 60% of South America's purchases of military equipment are done in the European Union. You know how much Latin America purchases from China? Look, if I do not go beyond a comma, it's zero. Zero. So in something so sensitive as your own security and your own defense, you are talking very loudly. The region is talking very loudly. We are talking very loudly. So, and let's not say in other dimensions that have to do with, let's call it human interaction. Tourists, back and forth, students, migrants. I mean, the overwhelming interaction, human interaction, is Mexico and Central America in every dimension. With the US, the overwhelming interaction of South America in tourism, student exchanges, and migration colonies is with the European Union. So Central America is very US-centered. South America is very European. None of the above. China plays any relevant role, okay? So just a final message, Luis. To me, this means that the EU and Latin America is a marriage meant to be. We share Western values, we share cultural heritage, and very importantly, we are complements as economic and trade partners. Latin America has abundant natural resources, energy, rare minerals, sun, wind, water, and fertile lands to be able to produce abundant, cheap, and clean energy and organic foods that we are actually doing. And the European Union has the capital, the technology, and the know-how that Latin America needs to develop, in part through the new requirements of the green transition and the digital transition. So if finally the EU-Mercosur agreement were finalized, the EU would have association agreements that are larger than simply integration agreements, trade integration agreements, are much larger, with 94% of the region's GDP. It would be by far the largest association agreement of which human history has any notice. We've been 20 years discussing it. Every time there is a chance, and I lived it through as Minister of Foreign Affairs in Uruguay in 2020, every time there is a chance and we think that we are going to sign it, somebody drops the ball 5 yards into the ingold, and we know who drops the ball in general. And all I'm saying is, look, until the politically impossible, I mean, we need to get this marriage going. We need to remove the obstacle. As I always like to say, until the politically impossible becomes inevitable. And in this day and age of geopolitical rivalry, I think it has become inevitable. So basically, we need to get to work. Thank you, Luis.
Thank you very much, Ernesto. This was really fascinating. I would say you've managed to challenge some perceptions, and it's difficult to do so because perceptions, when they stick, they are very resilient. So you've managed to challenge them on the basis of facts and numbers, which is no small feat. I also liked very much the fact that you went far beyond the economy of the continent. You brought to the table issues related to social development. Your comparison, for example, of human development and income trends in the continent is one that I personally like to highlight, because I consider at least the numbers or the trends that we see on the basis of the HDI and similar indicators as a very powerful message about the progress broader than economic, in the economic sense, in that part of the world. But you also brought to the table the issues related to geopolitics, and that's particularly important nowadays when forces are pulling different parts of the world in different directions, and we are seeing divergence in geopolitical terms, views of the world, and it's very useful to situate where Latin America is in that in those tensions. We have a number of questions here for you, Ernesto. Let me start with Aida, and I'll read it to you in the chat, from the chat, that she thanks you very much for your inspiring talk. And she asks, in a context of global polarization, how can, that ties in very well with this last point that you made, how can Latin American countries strengthen regional cooperation to tackle common challenges?
Well, thank you for that question. I know that we usually argue that in foreign and trade policy that the America does not talk with one voice, and that's what we actually say. But when you look at the track record that I just showed you, center left, center right, we tend to vote in the same ways through countries, and whether governments are to the left or to the right of the center, and that it is as if we are speaking in a sense with one voice, even though nobody is coordinating it in a very efficient way. Now, to me, to precipitate that coordination, you need the kind of external force that will actually put you into that mode. And so what we were suggesting in 2016 with my colleague, Antoni Estevadordal, who is a great economist and a specialist in trade integration and trade agreements and negotiations, we proposed a trans-American partnership between the US and the Latin America that already has agreements, bilateral trade agreements with the US, which are 11 countries. And the problem is that we have a hub and spoke system whereby everybody trades with the US according to certain rules given by the agreements, but we do not have the same rules among ourselves. There's no harmonization of agreements. This does not require new laws. This does not require new openings. It's very technical. It's to try to harmonize rules of origins, standards, regulations, customs systems, in order for us to be able to establish a connection and a dialogue amongst the countries that we have an agreement with the US, and not only with the center. And the same we are suggesting for Europe. If the European Union should complete the agreement with Mercosur, we think that if we look strategically, since the EU would be the largest player in the region with agreements, association agreement, 94% of the region's GDP, then we could think of harmonizing all these agreements and creating a huge economic space between the EU and Latin America that would be 1.1 trillion people and would have the size of the US GDP. So it would be humongously important strategically. And I think that in order to pursue it in a way that gives us an impulse, these external forces help not only to kindle the process, but to sustain it and coordinate it, because we are out for a common objective. Other than that, you can do piecemeal by integrating energy or internal rivers through hidrovías, and actually Uruguay is doing a lot of that with Brazil, just to give you an example. So there's a lot of cooperation going on, but not in a way that would create a great economic space and a standardized set of rules that would allow capital to flow in, to invest in the region, in supply chains, and export back to the rich markets where there would be preferential access. We need that. I know it's out of fashion, but we are proposing something that is mostly technical, except for the EU-Mercosur agreement, which eventually will need political will to be able to be finalized.
Let me, if you allow me, Ernesto, just to push you a little further on this, and following up on Aida's question, I think you make a very important point. Regulatory barriers are an important element in this process of integration within the region. But do you think that the economic structure of the countries in the region, the type of exports, the type of comparative advantages, is that an obstacle to further integration within regions, right? I mean, to a certain extent, that could, that will influence, or it does influence, what countries can trade with each other if they are exporting similar things to third markets, if they have comparative advantages that are very comparable, and then and at the same time have limited access to third markets. I'm raising this because this is another perception that is often put on the table. What's your take on that?
My take, Luis, if I were to say it just to make a point, is that this has more to do with rules and market access, homogeneous, harmonized rules, regulations, standards, in order to be able to trade and go back and forth at very low cost in services, in goods, in capital, and if it is in people, even better. And I think that's the great difference with Asia. Asia really has intra-regional agreements and where all these can happen at ease. So my question would be, yeah, we might have similar structures of production, even though Argentina produces soybeans and Brazil produces planes. So it also produces soybean. But Germany sells Audi and Mercedes to Italy, and Italy sells Fiat to Germany. So we have intra-industry trade. So I cannot guess what the possibilities would be, even if we have similar productive structures, which we have not measured that this similarity, but I believe there is a potential there to make extraordinary gains. Actually, we made a simulation only for trading goods, Luis, on doing what we are suggesting for the Mercosur, EU, and then homogenizing all the agreements. And the simulations that we did with the Bank of Spain, with 3 researchers of the Bank of Spain, indicate that trade between the EU and Latin America would grow 70%, and intra-Latin America trade would grow 40%. So this is a big number,
Absolutely, very telling indeed. There's another question coming up in the chat, Nestor. I will summarize it. It's really about a point that you've made about the energy transition in how it affects Latin America. It's often, again, another perception, a rather positive one in terms of the potential of the region in this area, not only given the wealth of most countries in the region in minerals, natural resources that are essential for the transition. You mentioned that in the context of market access, the point you made earlier on. Beyond market access, what do you think is needed for the continent, for the key economies in the continent, to make the most of this opportunity that is opening up for them?
Look, Luis, maybe I'm being monothematic with this, but I think it illustrates the point. Market access is one point of the fact that you can produce in the energy chain, and we can go very high up in the sophistication out of basic commodities, really. So again, the idea that commodity exporters are condemned not to develop. Everybody is condemned not to develop, as we saw. So, and there's nothing in and on itself in commodity to being a commodity exporter, like in Canada or New Zealand or Australia, to prevent you from developing, because, and I can tell you from my own country, and I toured the country 5 times in the last 4 years, the commodity producing sector can be very basic or can get enormously sophisticated. And sophisticated products like organic meat or milk, formulated milk that you use as a Danone and Nestlé use as an input for baby food. Look, those are not commodities. Those are ordered as if you were a chef producing it, and they are governed by long-term contracts with big firms. They are not commodities with trade that you sell to traders. So I think the opportunity was there even before this green transition. And but now it is again on the table, and we need the market access for our sophisticated products, and we need not only predictable rules, which is what we always say of the game to bring out investment. We are going more beyond that. Look, if we were to have an agreement with the European Union, rules would not only be predictable, they would be the same as in the European Union. They would be very similar. We would develop a common language to trade, to invest, and therefore that gives both institutional and political certainty. Even with the most reactionary candidates everywhere, like Trump in the US, he did not repeal NAFTA. He came up with a new agreement which everybody is happy with. So these things, once you've created private sector interests behind the scenes, are very difficult to repeal, because you are going to destroy a lot of entrenched interest. It's not that easy. These are not autocracies. When they tell me, let me give you this as an example. Sorry about, I'm getting a little bit extended on the response. When they tell me, and I'll talk about your own maternal country, I think you told me, Luis, Brazil. Look, when they tell me, look, they are going to make an arrangement with China so they can pay their exports in Brazilian exports in renminbi. I say, well, this is great. If somebody has oil and the owner is the state, maybe they can do that. But in Brazil, exports are the private sector. So you are going to tell a private firm, look, you are going to have to accept being paid in renminbi. So what they well, I'm sorry, I don't want to get paid in renminbi. I want to get paid in dollars. And if you want me to accept renminbis, you will have to give me an insurance exchange rate vis-a-vis the dollar. So you cannot impose on societies that are essentially private sector driven voluntaristically these things. So trade agreements, once you've reached, or association agreements, an agreement and created a lot of activity under the umbrella of that agreement, are very difficult to reverse. And that gives both predictability and knowledge about the type of rules you are enforcing.
Very, very well noted, Ernesto. Never too much to mention the complexities of the political economy of reform in all areas of policy. It's always a factor that one cannot set aside. Let me thank you, Ernesto, for making the time to be with us today to share the key messages of the book. Thanks for being with us. You know that the invitation is always on the table for you to come back in this seminar series or beyond. Let me also recognize Aida, Paula, Hema, Francois for having done the heavy lifting to make this seminar happen, and look forward to the next time, Ernesto. Thanks again.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure. Unfortunately, through Zoom, I can't see the participants except for a few. But let me tell you this, just to end on a positive note. The political economy is not something out there that is happening or not. It is something that we, and I include you, have a responsibility to precipitate. And you are in Paris, and France has been one of the obstacles to this agreement being fulfilled. And therefore, we have to work hard to try to persuade those in a position to decide that you might have to compensate losers, but this is socially, economically, and strategically convenient for both regions.
Well noted again. By the way, your background is very telling about the importance of agriculture in many of these issues. So great to have you with us. Thanks a lot, Ernesto. All the best. Bye.
All the best for you.
Bye. And thanks everyone who've made the time to join us today. Thank you.
Bye-bye.